next week we're going to have a talk by Christine Shua, one of our own here, who's going to be making her triumphant return for a back talk next week. So we're looking forward to that. So today is a Frank Marlowe Memorial Lecture. And to remind everyone, Frank was an anthropology PhD. He earned his PhD here at UCLA, student of Nick Burton-Jones, in 1997. He tragically passed away in 2019, well before his time, but through a very generous donation of Frank's family, we've been able to establish the Frank Marlowe Memorial Lecture, which hosts speakers here at Beck who are scientifically engaging with the core themes of Frank's research, which include studies of hunter-gatherers, behavioral ecology of foragers, cross-cultural psychology, and mating systems. So that's why we're all here today. And I'm here also to introduce Kim Hill, who's very well suited to be a Frank Marlowe Memorial Lecture giver. Kim is a professor of anthropology at Arizona State University. His research is perfectly aligned with the goals of the Frank Marlowe Memorial Lecture. His research on hunter-gatherer societies and human evolution is both groundbreaking and path-defining in many regards. Too many to be able to summarize in the usual Beck short way that we do these introductions. But nevertheless, I want to talk a little bit about Kim's work to situate what we're going to see here today. So beginning in the 1970s, Kim started making near yearly visits to eastern Paraguay to live with the Ache people, where he conducted intensive field work. And over the course of a few decades, he spent over 10 years of his life in the field carrying out intensive ethnographic work focusing on subsistence, cooperation, social organization, demography, technology change, life history, and much else. So Kim has done a lot of work in eastern Paraguay, that's for sure. That's what he's most well known for, but he's also carried out a great deal of ethnographic work in other places, including Venezuela, Peru, Panama, South Africa, and now his active field site in the Philippines, which he'll be talking to us about today. So many, if not most of us here in the Beck community probably have very well-worn, dog-eared or copies of some of Kim's work, and we're likely to be referencing it whenever we write about or whenever we teach about the unique aspects of human evolution and those key traits that define the human species. And so he's had a very large impact on our field. I also know that Kim and Frank interacted at a very early time, probably in this very room in the early 1980s when Frank was a graduate student and Kim was giving some of his first talks. And there's a nice little poetic element to how these exchanges can multiply and amplify over the years. So I know, having spent some time with Kim in the field in Paraguay, he taught me some of the most important tips, like what do you do on the first day when you're doing ethnographic research in a new community? And what Kim taught me is that you go around and do a household census. It's very practical to be able to get to know people, and it also yields important scientific data. You never know. Well, in this one case, it actually did yield a really interesting collaboration between Kim and myself and Frank. So around 2009, Kim contacted me about a paper he was writing that was assembling the largest possible data set of kinship and co-residence for hunter-gatherer societies. It was a really exciting project. It was a new direction of research for our field. I mentioned this project to Frank, and he was also very enthusiastic about this and was very happy to contribute data he had collected with the Hadza to this project. So what's interesting historically is that was probably some of the very first data that he had also, following the good advice of no doubt that Nick Burton-Jones had given him about how to do research in these societies. So he had provided some data that ended up in this paper that was very well received and lives on today as a part of Frank's and Kim and all of our field's legacy. And we're very happy to have Kim here to talk to us about his new work. Thank you.
Yay. Can you make sure that the volume's up on your laptop?
Actually, the secret to the first day in the field is not actually doing a census. That's probably what I do on the second day. On the first day, you know what I usually do? Because I've worked in so many remote places, and sometimes it's very, first day we throw a big party and give away a lot of food to everybody. So get in good with the community first, and then on the second day you do the census. Yeah, sometime in the mid-1980s, I've given probably 6 or 8 talks at UCLA in my career. The first one was in 1982, if you can believe that. I think in the second or third talk, I remember Frank sitting in the, Frank was a graduate student at that time, so we went way back. Anyways, today, let me grab a laser pointer. Is there a way to dim this light so that the screen shows up better, or do you always do it that way? Just this one light is glaring off the screen. There we go. Perfect, perfect. Okay, so I spent most of my career doing field work in South America, and then I did 6 years in South Africa with coastal Khoisan foragers, and then moved over into Southeast Asia about 11 years ago. And so this is new stuff. Everything I'm going to show today is actually still unpublished. So, yes.
We're getting feedback from your Zoom audience saying you need to be closer to your computer.
Oh, that's right. I got to stand here so they can hear me.
Yeah.
All right, see if I can do, because I want to be able to see my screen and point. Okay, can you guys hear me now, Dan? I see. Okay, okay, got it. Anyways, I'm going to talk about new stuff, new field site, new work that nobody's ever seen before outside my own university, because it's still unpublished. A lot of it's now in press, and it's fun to do new stuff. And right off the bat, I need to mention Julia Phelps, one of my graduate students who's done a lot of this work with me, amazing at data analysis and statistical modeling and everything, and she's going to be going back to the Philippines with me in 3 weeks from now, and we're going to continue with some modifications. So now my slides aren't moving forward. Huh. I don't know how to am I going to have to do this manually for every slide? It's not going to automatically advance for me?
I think you do have to do it manually, right?
All right. One of the things I actually do have in common with Frank, I would say, is that we both love to do lots of field work. Brian mentioned that I'd done 10 years. I've actually done 17 years of field work over the last period of time. I calculated I've spent more than a third of my life in the field at this point. So this talk today is going to be really heavily oriented towards field data collection and analysis. There we go. So first thing I want to mention, I've framed in the last 15 or 20 years my big question that's just the thing that's really eating at me and driving me is trying to understand why Homo sapiens is such an outlier species. And we really are. By lots of objective criteria, we're just truly a spectacular anomaly. There's over 9 million eukaryotic species on this planet, and the humans are way off scale for all kinds of things you could measure. 2 examples that I often pull out is biological dominance. You know, we cycle more nitrogen than all other terrestrial forms of life on Earth. 98% of all terrestrial vertebrate biomass is us and our domestic animals, and so on and so on. Amazing biological success and amazing complexity. If we define complexity as many parts in intricate arrangement, human societies are more specialized than...
Can I just move the podium where you want to stand?
Sure. Yeah, I see I'm doing it again, right?
Yeah, right.
Because okay. This will be good. All right. More specialized than metazoan bodies. There's way more different roles and complementarity of productive roles in human societies than there are, for example, if we look at the number of cell types in our bodies and so on. Anyways, lots of measures. I'm not going to go into these. It's really easy to argue that humans are a bizarre outlier, and that troubles me as a biologist because My original training was actually in biology, not anthropology, and I was really heavily taught to believe that convergent evolution was always important, and whenever something was a good adaptation, it always reemerged repeatedly over and over again. So why aren't there a whole bunch of other species that are almost like humans? That to me is a huge puzzle. That's one of our biggest questions. How did humans get to be so weird, and why are there no other species that are even remotely close to us? And my colleagues and I, who've been working on this for 15 years now, have come up with kind of a tentative model that there is no one simple, easy answer. It's actually a combination of a whole bunch of different traits, none of which are unique to humans, but when you put the whole combination together and the interaction effects between them, you end up getting ultimately complex institutions and technology and so on, which ultimately are what are accounting for things like our biological dominance. So last time I gave a talk at UCLA about 10 years ago, I actually gave this talk, Origins of Human Uniqueness it was called. So I'm not going to repeat everything today, but this is what's framing my obsession in the last few years with studying this piece of it. This is my little piece. I can't do everything. But I've gotten really interested in cooperation and why human cooperation looks so different than other eukaryotes, other vertebrates, other mammals, other primates. As you move up, there's just nothing close to us. And I think I'm going to show you today a study that's kind of a first of its kind. I was actually really shocked that other people haven't already done what I'm about to show you. That really makes humans look incredibly different from all the rest of the primates in terms of cooperation. So, yeah, and so I'm really obsessed with this. Human cooperation appears to be exceptional. Why and in what ways? And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I really want to get into the data study, but there's kind of 4 areas that I'm really interested in. The fact that humans became cooperative breeders, that the way they behave towards affines is totally unique. We're the only species in the universe that we know on Earth that behaves preferentially and cooperatively with affines. I assume everybody, this is an anthropology department, everybody knows what affines are, right? In-laws matter to humans and no other species on the planet. And there's some things about the unique human social structure. I think this is the paper you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that paper, which I thought was really fun and in fact did show that there's some unique properties of human social structure, ended up doing really well. It's got like 1,500 citations at this point, and I just learned that from my chair this week, which is why I know the number. Anyways, there's some unique things about human cooperative breeding and social structure. There's some unique things about skill-intensive niches and complementarity and exchange, which is what we're going to be looking at today. There's some unique stuff about humans doing way more teaching than any other species, and how that plays into heavy reliance on social learning. And then finally, some really weird stuff about social norms that enforce cooperation and other behavioral patterns that we just don't see in other animals. Okay, so today I want to talk about cooperation, and my new study population, as we learned, is all the way around the world, on the other side of the world from where I spent most of my life in Amazonia. This village is called Linao of the Mangroves, and Linao in the Samal language means tidal, quiet area of the sea or something like that. Anyways, I started working here in 2011, 2012, started doing serious data collection on this process, on this project in about 2014. These are Samal tribal people that are found all throughout Southeast Asia, so-called sea gypsies or sea nomads. The local people all call them Bajau. And so I'm working with them down here, right there in southern Mindanao, but you can see they're all over Indonesia, Malaysia, practically over to New Guinea. Widespread tribal group that once were completely nomadic and lived on ocean-going outriggers. And then starting in about the 1950s, they began to settle in different areas of the world and build houses out over the ocean, over the reef flats. And the community that I live with, so this is Linao. They've been living in southern Mindanao in the Philippines for about 30 years now. They're kind of newcomers to the area. These are some Google Earth satellite images of what the village looked like from 2009 to 2016. You can see a little bit of change, but built out over the ocean. They actually have no legal property or land rights, and that's one of the issues. The people who live on the land over here are actually Blaan tribal people, completely different language and culture and so on. And there's considerable exchange, as we're going to see in a minute. But this is their life, basically. They rarely go to shore except when they need to exchange things. A few background pieces of information about the study population. I think it's important to have a little bit of context, otherwise when I start throwing up statistical models and so on, everything gets too abstract. So here's the village a couple years ago. 9% of all possible dyads of randomly chosen individuals were close kin, meaning first cousins or closer. So to give you an idea, how much is this a village of people who are related versus unrelated? A lot of individuals are not closely related, but most households have at least one member. So about almost 50% of all households have at least one member who is at least as close as a first cousin to other members of other randomly chosen households. So I call this kind of intermediate village relationship. Not really related, but not really unrelated. The political structure, they had one chief, and that was it, pretty much. And the chief died in 2018. I was actually holding his hand when he died, and it was a very traumatic moment. And he was succeeded by his daughter, which was really wild because this is a very conservative Muslim community. Despite the fact that they have their own tribal religion, they've also converted to Islam. And the fact that he put a woman in as his successor was kind of an interesting and big deal. But in any case, I originally started studying in Linao because I'm interested in populations that are doing intertidal marine foraging. And then later I discovered that actually fishing is a bigger part of their economy. But for the first couple of years, I mainly studied this. So people collecting foraging resources. I was really interested in marine communities because the resource base is dense, predictable, and very less depletable over time than our terrestrial communities. And therefore that should lead to a whole bunch of interesting social phenomena, perhaps territoriality, and so on and so on. That was the original plan I had when I went to these marine communities, and then later my interest kind of changed. Anyways, you can see marine invertebrates are very important, and they fit this description perfectly. Sea hares lay 500 million eggs in a lifetime. It's almost impossible to deplete. This is the resource here. They don't kill the adults, they harvest the eggs. It's non-depletable, it's very dense, it's very rich, and so on and so on. Anyways, but today's talk is not really going to focus on the productive economy as much as looking at what happens outside production. So I discovered very quickly after 2 years of data collection that fishing actually contributes 7 times as much household calories as does invertebrate collection. So I kind of revised my view that this is really a fishing village rather than a marine invertebrate economy. But yeah, daily life in Linao, sometimes they get really great fish harvests and they can dry lots and lots of fish, and they either store them for later consumption or they can go out nearby up in the hills here and trade some of their fish for rice, which is their main carbohydrate staple, and so on. A lot of festivals through the year, a lot of fun times out on the boats. I personally like to do snorkeling and scuba diving a lot, and this is the perfect field site for that. Anyway, so let's look at the economy just really quickly. Everything that I'm going to talk about in terms of material goods, resources, is going to be converted into US dollars. So we weigh and measure the stuff, then we take the local market value, then we convert it to US dollars so that graduate students can understand what you're talking about when you say so much fish and so much invertebrate. Here's the productive income. Turns out about 65% of it comes from marine foraging, and the remaining part is what I would call beginnings of market integration. So sometimes people get paid to do things like boat repair or even a little bit of tourism every once in a while. Mean per capita income is $6 per household per day. If that works out per person, it's about $1.50 per person per day. The mean cost, this is the value of their production. The mean value of what they're consuming is about 84 cents per person per day. So above consumption, they're earning maybe 60 cents a day that can be converted into anything else. And the things they have to buy are clothing occasionally, medicines occasionally, adornments, whatever else. Some of them smoke cigarettes and they waste their money on that, whatever. Anyway, so this is what the productive economy looks like. But what we are interested in is what happens to all these resources and how much flow is there going on between households. All right, so this will just give you an idea of what we would call inequality, wealth inequality. So daily income ranges, let's just read this right here. The top 10% of the village has a daily income of about 10 times higher than the bottom 10%. So here's about 36 families right here that make up most of our sample. So there is a little bit of income inequality, but it's not, the Gini coefficient here is a lot lower than it is in the US, for example. All right, so what we're interested in is this: goods and services provided to individuals in another household where no price or date of repayment is agreed upon. In other words, we're not talking about commercial transactions or formal exchange. We're talking about things like sharing and helping activities. Goods being shared, services, I'm going to call that helping for right now. Here's our sample over about 3.5 years, 493 daily interviews. These are all based on 24-hour recall interviews. So we go, I'm going to show you an interview in a second, go to a house, sit down with either the female head of the household because her husband's out fishing, or often both spouses if they happen to be there. Sometimes older children sit in, and we ask questions about, in the last 24 hours, tell me everything that your family was given by any other household and everything that your household gave to any other household, for example. We'll see, I'll show you the questions in a minute. It works out with our household sample to 973 unique dyads of households. So we can see, for example, which houses share more with each other and which ones share less with each other, one of our big questions. And a lot of this is analyzed on a day-by-day basis. So we have more than 12,000 daily dyadic observations that are going to be in some of the statistical models I show you. All right, so here's my research assistants doing interviews. We've got 2 graduate students from Mindanao State University that I recruited out of the marine biology program to work with us. Because these people in Linao speak Samal as their first language and Bisaya as their second language. And I can speak a little bit of Bisaya, but no Samal at all. So we've got graduate students who speak fluent English and Bisaya, and between that, we carry on formal interviews, kind of a 3-way translation. So here's Kier Pitogo and Angelica, my 2 graduate students. This is what the interviews look like. So this is actually a page right out of some field notes. The first interview is just about daily production. So what things, list any and all food and non-food volumes of food items of value that your household produced or harvested yesterday. And here you can see in this household they listed there were actually 5 people living in the house, but 2 of them are small children that didn't produce anything. So we've got Esnipa, the woman head of the household. She says that she got drinking water, more drinking water, more drinking water. Some of this is for her family, and some of it she actually sold commercially to the local Blaan tribal people who don't have a source of drinking water. Her husband went out fishing, and her other son apparently also mainly fishing. Now look at something like this. List all the food and non-food items that you received yesterday from anyone outside your household. Crops, fish, medicinal plants, blah, blah, blah. And this is what they listed. 1 piece of fried fish given to her by Fatima, a relative. Pio Sordi gave her 1 bowl of fish soup. Her son got 1 cigarette from another guy. And then one of her other sons here, somebody gave him money, 2 Philippine pesos, 2 Philippine pesos, 2 Philippine pesos. 4 people gave him cash money. 5 Philippine pesos is worth a dime. So 2 pesos is close to 2 cents or something like that. So we're talking about people giving people tiny, tiny amounts of money, but many times per day. A nickel, a dime, a penny, whatever. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. What's going on when you do somebody a favor by giving them a nickel? Anyways, so the big deal, what I want to hype about this study and this talk is that I was amazed when I was looking for comparative data in other societies to discover, as far as I can tell, this is the first study ever done, ever published, that examines inter-household transfers of all material goods and all services simultaneously. And what I mean by all is that I actually started my career in graduate school really early on in 1984, I believe. I published one of the first quantitative studies of food sharing. There's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of studies of food sharing, but nobody has looked at the sharing of lots and lots of other things, like tools and clothing and adornments and so on and so on. Same thing for services. We went out and looked, and I could not find any other published study in anthropology where somebody recorded all the different ways that households help each other on a daily basis. So what we ended up getting in a 4-year period was 490 different types of material goods being transferred, not just food. That's a lot more than food going on. And 315 unique types of services performed for individuals in other households. And I'm going to show you quick little examples of that, and then we're going to do lots of statistical analysis on who's sharing more, who's sharing less, and which dyads are doing more and less for each other, and so on. The mean value of all goods being transferred was $4 per day per household. If you remember a couple slides back, I showed you the mean household income is only $6 per day. So the value of what's being received through sharing per day is almost as high as the daily income. That's pretty significant part of what's going on in their lives. And 268 minutes per day on average of services received by each household by members of other households. You know, that's 4.5 hours a day of services from people outside your household to people inside your household. So I would call that a pretty significant amount of helping that's going on. So lots of goods being transferred, lots of services being done, and back to my human uniqueness obsession, let's compare that to primates. Susan and I had long discussions this morning about what has she seen and what has she heard and so on. In general, and my friends at ASU, we've got a big group who studies chimpanzees. The Jane Goodall Institute is there, and several really well-known faculty members. As far as I can tell, chimpanzee focal follows and time allocation studies basically shows a little bit of food sharing, a little bit of grooming, and what's often called occasional coalitional support, and not many other examples of goods and services being transferred. So there's just a huge, I mean, it's not even on the same scale, difference between our nearest phylogenetic relatives and humans in terms of transfers of goods and services. This is what I said, I'm obsessed with why are humans so damn cooperative and why are we way off scale compared to other primates, for example. So let's look at inflow of goods, first of all. So we're going to start, I'm going to use jargon terms like inflow and outflow to refer to what comes into your house or what goes out of your house to others. And I call these goods and services. Some people complain and say, oh, you need to come up with a different word, whatever, as long as you understand me. So we're going to start with inflow of goods. And it's all measured in US dollars. So every single item ultimately gets converted into its US dollar value so that we can lump everything all together and look at big flows and so on. 46% of the total value transferred was in fact food. So food sharing is huge in humans. It's the single most important thing that's of a material good transfer. But second on the list was money, which kind of really shocked me. Somebody just made a joke to me today that money was quiet because you can hide it and you don't have to necessarily give it away. It doesn't spoil and go rotten like food does, and you don't have to have a daily intake the way you have to have a daily intake of food. There's a lot of arguments for why food should be shared whenever you have production variance. It's a lot harder to argue why money should be shared when in fact you could just stash it in your dresser drawer and hide it for later. But lots of money being transferred on a daily basis. However, the mean money event transfer was 28 cents per transfer, with more than 50% of the events were less than a dime's worth of money. So people are giving hundreds and hundreds of times per week. They're giving a nickel, a dime, 2 pennies, whatever. What's going on with that? I have some ideas on why you would give your neighbor a nickel, but we can come back to that later. One of the things that well, let's continue here. So food, money. Third category was drugs and medicines. A lot of this is natural medicines that come down from the jungle hills. People harvest and collect plants, and then they give some of that to their neighbors and so on. Clothing being transferred, tools being transferred, and then small amounts of things like bait, adornments, water, boat fuel, firewood, soap, dishes. The list goes on and on. I told you, over 490 different types of goods. This is one thing that surprised me. 16% of the money and 15% of the food transferred was households giving directly to children under the age of 15. So I thought a lot of the transfers were going to be adults transferring to adults. It's very, very common for adults to run into an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 12-year-old kid and give them a gift during the day. Some food, some money, clothes, whatever. Once again, makes us think a lot about what's going on in human societies. The fact that I saw so much food and money transfers by unrelated households to children just walking around was echoing in my mind that famous anthropological saying, it takes a village to raise a child. We need to really closely examine more carefully what's really going on in small-scale societies. And as I mentioned, the total intake through sharing was almost as high as the total daily intake through direct production. So sharing is a really significant part of their economy. And if you wanted to look at kinship, about 42% of all the transfers were between really close kin. Once again, this is as close as first cousins or closer, but significant transfers to distant kin, affines, unrelated individuals, and so on and so on. And it's these transfers that probably we're most puzzled by. Everybody who's studied evolutionary biology means, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to hypothesize why you would give gifts and so on to really close kin, because inclusive fitness alone could explain that. But when more than 50% of your transfers are to really distant kin or completely unrelated individuals, we've got to, think carefully about what's going on. Okay, so statistical models. What kinds of households provide more or receive more? So the very first question is going to be who gives more and who gets more. These are all general multiple linear regression models. We've got Bonferroni corrected confidence intervals. For those of you who are obsessed with statistics, this means we take into account how many independent tests we ran and then change the p-value, because if you run 20 tests at a p-value of 0.05 means you're always, by pure luck, always going to get one that looks significant. So you got to do a correction when you're running lots and lots of models. Independent effects are standardized, which means we measure all the independent variables in a one standard deviation change, and then the dependent outcome is always going to be either in dollars, increased or decreased dollars transferred, or minutes of help, increased and decreased. So the independent variables that we look at for inflows and outflows of material goods are these. Things about income, things about essentially correlations between giving and receiving, what a lot of people would probably call reciprocity. Number of juveniles in the household. You might predict that households with a lot of little kids are getting more and maybe giving less. It's kind of an obvious thing to think of. Some age effects. Which ages are more likely to be giving to what other age categories in the population? And then finally, we've got a variable on residential permanence. Turns out there's a slight tendency for people to be transferring more and getting more from those households that stay in the community all the time. Some households are more nomadic and they like to move out for a couple months and then move back in, and then they go off to Indonesia for a few months and then come back and stuff like that. So residential permanence. When we do that, I'm not going to show very many tables. I just want to show, this is what the table form of the output looks like. So here's the p-values over here, and these are the Bonferroni corrected p-values, and here's the coefficient estimates. So remember, a change in the number of dollars that you either get or give, dollars value of goods that you either get or give, as a function of a one standard deviation change in whatever the independent variable is. Tables are boring. Let's do it with figures. First, the highest coefficient. This is just a control, so we're going to ignore that one. The highest coefficient is the strongest predictor of how much households give on average is how much they get. The households that give the most are the same households that give. The households that give the most are the same ones that get the most. Second variable, income. Probably nobody's surprised. Rich households give more than poor households. All of our informants told us we would find that. They said, yeah, it really is true that the wealthier households are assisting and helping out the less wealthy households. Sure enough, that's true. There's an age effect, but it's complicated. We've got age squared, and age cubed because it's nonlinear. So in a minute, I'm just going to show you the shape rather than having you try to read the coefficients and work them out in your head. And then, so that was who gives the most. Now the next question is who gets the most. So now we've switched from outflow to inflow. Same thing, the strongest predictor with the highest coefficient, those who get the most are those who give the most. So both angles give you the same answer. Those who give the most are those who get the most, and those who receive the most are those who give the most in the community. Once again, there's an income effect, but it's more complicated. This is long-term measure of income, and this is short-term. The short-term one I want to focus on here, if you have a lower than average daily income, so this is, notice the coefficient is negative, which means when you have a lower than average daily income, you tend to receive more on that day. In other words, families are apparently paying attention to the fact that my neighbor had a bad day today, he didn't get any fish, so I'm going to give him more today. And that's what we detect statistically. There's another age effect here, and again, because it's complicated, I'm going to just show the shape of it in a minute. So here we go. Outflow, measured in dollars per day. Here's the age effect. Inflow. This is pretty weird, particularly this one. If you take it at face value, it implies that young people give more, and old people give more, and middle-aged people give the least. But over here, if we look at who's receiving, it looks like older households here, mean age at head of household, older households are receiving the most. This turned out to be complicated because we quickly discovered that it depends on what kind of good you're looking at. So if you separate it into food, money, and other, and this is, I'm trying to see what's the first, this is outflow up here and inflow down here. You can see this is kind of a complicated pattern, suggesting that sometimes certain, like old people tend to give away a lot of food, but they give the least amount of money away. Maybe that's not surprising. The old people are not very integrated into the money economy. Young people have more money. Anyways, I'm not going to get too hung up on this for right now until I show you the age patterns with services, and helping are much more clear about what's going on, where the services are flowing from what group to another. Okay, and then we've got the dyadic models. Which household Y gets more from what kind of household X? And we've got a bunch of variables here about relatedness, reciprocity, distance between the location of the households, income difference, age difference, and then we've got this interaction effect that's essentially inclusive fitness, which is income difference times relatedness. So need times kinship, that's what pure kin selection would predict you would see as a really strong effect. If they're both your close kin and they're high in need, you should see a lot of flow. Anyways, when we ran the models of what kind of household X gets the most from Y, or what kind of household X gives household Y gives the most to X, I'm going to show you some models really quickly. So these are dyadic. The strongest single predictor of what type of household Y gives more to household X is the households that get more from X give more to X. I hope I'm not confusing anybody, because I know I'm saying this a little fast. This looks like, technically it's a correlation. The households who get more from X are the same households household Y that give more back to X. I'm not going to say necessarily this proves reciprocity. I'm going to say there's a correlation between which households you're giving to and which households you're getting more back from. Coefficient of relatedness, yep, that has a high coefficient, and these double stars here mean that significant with the Bonferroni correction, so really highly significant. If you used a standard alpha p-value of 0.05, it would be extremely significant. Difference in income. Sure enough, just as we might not be surprised, richer households are tending to give more to poorer households. And then this interaction effect of need times kinship is also significant. And distance between houses. This is a negative coefficient, which means the houses that are closer together are the ones that are giving the most to each other. Probably doesn't shock or surprise anybody either. And there's a little age effect, which I'll come back to in a minute and show you once again with a figure. One of the things that shocked us about this giving and receiving was the number of times people justified transfers by using kinship terms for extremely distantly related individuals. So we're not talking about, I gave this to this person because it's my brother or it's my uncle or something. We're talking about people claiming that they gave it because that's my mother's 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 father's brother's daughter. Ridiculously low genetic coefficients of relatedness, and yet used to justify why I should be giving them stuff and why they should be giving me stuff. So this is one of the things we're really interested in. The puzzle of distant kinship appears to drive reciprocity because first it appears to increase trust. That's one of our guesses. Same thing with affines, ridiculous connections. You know, I gave this to my mother's fathers, brothers, daughters, spouses, mothers. It's just, they go on, but they'll use that as the justification for why they gave somebody a present or some food, or why that person gave them a cigarette or some money or whatever. So we really need to think about how humans are using kinship in some cases to either establish trust so they get reciprocity, or for whatever other reason justify why it makes sense that we should have reciprocal arrangements. Now let's jump really quick. I'm going to run out of time for sure, but I got to do a little bit of this. Services. Services to me are even more interesting because I said it doesn't look like anybody's done this work in the past. So this is tasks or activities provided to individuals in another household where no price or date of repayment is agreed upon. In other words, these can't be formal transactions where I mow your lawn and then later you promise to wash my clothes or something. It has to be, you did me a favor, and then if I return it, it's not because we had an agreement that I was going to pay you or do something back from you. And also activities deemed to be coordinated labor, like when the men go out fishing all together in a boat, they do lots and lots of stuff for each other, but they're all splitting the fish at the end of the day, and so it's not really an altruistic donation of a helping behavior, and then later we'll see what happens. We're all working together to produce the same fish. So none of that is in the database we're about to analyze. Explicit trade is omitted, coordinated labor is omitted. Lots and lots of different kinds of services. Just to give you some examples, some of the most important. So we break these down into domains and then category types and then actually specific examples within the categories. 144,809 minutes of services that came into our household in the database, and an equivalent number of services that went out, so that the sum total is almost 300,000 minutes of observed helping over the 4-year sample period. And I'm going to show you in a minute, but the biggies: childcare, grooming, domestic services, technology services. Let me just show you what this looks like. Oh, and if you want to get some idea of, what is he talking about? Give me some specific examples. I can't quite grasp this. Helped in household chores, helped carry water container, helped cook, assisted collect firewood, assisted him walk, helped him make charcoal, helped him wash clothes, helped him wash dishes, helped fetch water, and on and on. You can see what we're talking about when we're talking about what I call the transfer of services from one household to another. I'm going to say really quickly, and I can come back to this in the discussion, that females are doing about 65% of all minutes and males only about 35% of all minutes. So this is interesting. Women are doing way more in the way that we measured it, and there's some methodological issues there. Women seem to be doing a lot more services back and forth between households than men do. Men are out on their boats fishing a lot during the day, and remember I said we don't count that as, those coordinated fishing don't get counted as helping behaviors. So here's the domains down here. Here's age categories: children, young adults. Julia called these older adults, but I would call them middle-aged people, and then finally elderly, over 55. So let's watch and see what happens. First, really important, inflow. Young females receive a lot of help with childcare. Outflow, where's that coming from? It's mainly coming from middle-aged and elderly women. So middle-aged and old women helping young women do childcare. Notice it's the highest bar on this curve. This is only looking at female activities now. So that's the first biggie. Alloparental care, as we would call it in the jargon, right? huge in humans. Second one, domestic chores. This is doing things like cooking for you, or helping you do your laundry, or washing your clothes, or going to collect water for you, or cleaning your house, all kinds of things. In this case, the recipients tend to be elderly women, and the donors tend to be middle-aged women, the highest donor class. Notice here, not much going on with children doing, they're not really, they don't own a lot of this stuff, so they couldn't receive it, but they're also not doing a lot of it. Grooming. This is cool. Females doing lots of grooming for each other. Most of this was removal of lice and ectoparasites and other things like shampooing your hair for you, or looking through your toenails to see what, things like that. I'm going to point this out because a significant amount, middle and even young and middle-aged females doing a lot of grooming of young and middle-aged and in older age females. Wait till we look at males, and you're going to see males do. So here's males. Here's males. Let me grab that. Where's grooming? Nothing. Grooming, nothing. Males don't groom each other at all, but females do a lot of grooming. Pretty interesting, because that one probably doesn't match primates very well. Depends on, it matches probably the female philopatric primates, but maybe not the male. I don't know. You could come up with stories about what's going on there, but of course there's obviously some cultural issues, like, is it really appropriate for males to touch each other intimately in this society? And maybe not, probably not, and that may be the reason why you never see males sitting close together and looking through each other's hair and everything, but women do it all the time. What are males doing? You can see there's only one biggie there. Technology. Outflow from middle-aged and elderly males to mainly middle-aged and elderly males. What am I talking about? Technology services helping? Fixing your boat, making tools for you, helping you fix your net, carrying lumber for you to help build your house, and so on and so on. Men do lots and lots of stuff for other men that have to do what we call making and fixing and repairing, so on and so on, technology. By the way, these kinds of things often in the men didn't take very many minutes. So the women would do childcare and babysit each other's kids for 2 hours, right? Then the man would come home from fishing and help his neighbor carry the canoe up the hill to repair it, and that only took him like 8 minutes. By our measure, we would say women were doing way more helping than men. But when we interviewed the people, they're like, well, the man, it only took 8 minutes, but his work was really hard, and the other guy could have never carried the boat without his help. So they kind of thought that we were missing the boat by saying women have got 240 minutes and men have only got 8 minutes, so therefore women's helping is more important than men's helping. Maybe measuring things in minutes is not the best way to go for some of this stuff. Anyways, big differences between those who received the most help. There's about a 40-fold difference between the highest recipients of help and the lowest recipients of help per day. So once again, some people are getting tons of help and other people way, way less, just like we saw in the goods being transferred. And once again, we can look at p-values and tables. The coefficients are measured again as one standard deviation change, and the effect measured in how many minutes increase or decrease. Let's look at graphs. The strongest predictor of who received the most in minutes per day was the same families, the same households who gave the most in minutes per day. So once again, correlation. Those who receive the most are those who give the most in time, minutes per day in assistance. Number of juvenile consumers predicted getting more help. Residential permanency predicted getting more help. There's an age effect that I'll come back to again because we're going to need to actually see the shape in a graph. And income. This is kind of interesting. People who spent the most time fishing and had the highest income actually were also getting the most number of minutes of help from their neighbors. That one seems a little weird because you'd think maybe you won't help the rich people out as much, but in this case, the high-income families are actually getting more minutes of help from everybody else. When we ask the opposite, then who gives the most in minutes per day? Same thing. The most important by far and away is those who receive the most are the same families who give the most. So the correlation between giving and receiving, in a minute I'm going to again talk about, is this reciprocity. And then some of this, basically the same kinds of effects as we saw before. Here's the age effect. This one's a little more clear what's going on. Young people are getting the most help, old people are giving the most help. And what I mean by old is maybe over about age 40, this starts going up pretty steeply, and down here under age 40, they're getting a lot of help. So this looks kind of like maybe a life history issue where young people are really heavily constrained by lots of young children and whatever, and maybe they don't have as many skills. The young men don't know how to build boats, so they get a lot of help from the old men, and so on and so on. I'm going to skip through this one because it's going to show us the same thing. It's just the mirror image. Instead of asking, this is just which families are more likely to help each other. And once again, coefficients of relatedness matter more. Mean age differences, older families are more likely to be helping younger families. Reciprocity, once again, if family Y gets more help from family X, family Y also gives more help to family X. It's the highest coefficient here in our models. Same thing over and over again. So now let's get to the end. Big picture. I got to wrap up. This is the first study I'm aware of that anybody's looked at all the services going on in small-scale society in a small village between households. We're finding that caretaking is really important. Domestic activities seem to be really important. Technological services by men, making each other tools and helping people who don't know how to make arrows or hooks or nets or spears or whatever, doing it for them or helping them do it, and so on and so on. Let me just pull this up. So, high correlations between giving and receiving. In general, when I first started talking about this, I wanted to call it reciprocity, but I got nailed by a few picky people who said, you can get high correlations between giving and receiving, and it's not necessarily reciprocity. In order to prove that it's reciprocity, you got to show the effect, the contingency effect of what happens if somebody stops giving. Can you show me that if family A stops giving, then B stops giving back to them? Because the other possibility, imagine this, that this would produce a positive correlation. Let's say that popular people give more and get more. If that were true, all of our statistical results would come out making it look like those who give the most or those who receive the most, and also dyads. The popular dyads would be giving more to each other and receiving more from each other, and it would make it look like dyadic reciprocity. So we got to be really careful and say, this is consistent with reciprocity, and I pretty much think that it is based on talking to people, but so far what we've got are correlations between giving and receiving. Kinship matters, but here's the really fun thing, and I published a paper on this almost 15 years ago with Wes Allen Arave and Mike Gervin, that reciprocity apparently is often really strongly driven by the preference to get in reciprocal arrangements with kin. In other words, there's good evidence that kinship matters because it makes it much more likely that you'll have a strong reciprocal relationship with somebody. Mike Gervin later on, not too long ago, published this thing, Reciprocity Explains Food Sharing in Humans and Other Primates. One of the things we seem to be learning is that reciprocity, a lot more than inclusive fitness, seems to be driving an awful lot of the cooperation that we're seeing in human societies. Some types of resources like food and money are shared very differently. We need to move forward and start getting into really complicated analysis, like, is it the case that some families trade childcare for food? Is it the case that some families trade medicines for money, you know, all those kinds of different currencies, different services for goods, different goods for other goods, and so on. We haven't started analyzing that yet. So that's one of the things we're going to learn. Here's Julia Phelps, my graduate student at ASU. I think you guys are probably going to be hearing from her. She's one of the most amazing students I've worked with in my 40-year career. She's going back to the field with me in 3 weeks. And here's our 2 research assistants. Keir has now come over to the University of Kansas and is getting his PhD in conservation biology. Angelica's still working on our team. And this is a really fun place to work. The people are so nice and friendly. I have a great time going out on the reef, snorkeling every day, and I get to meet people like this. Somebody in this room has got to know who that is, right? How many people know who that dude is? You're not going to believe this story. He's our next door neighbor at Linao. He owns the next property over from my field site, and I go over and have lunch with him and go scuba diving with him. I jog in the morning with him and his 10 bodyguards. Who would have ever thought that was going to happen when we randomly picked a nomadic sea gypsy population, right? So anyways, thanks. That's it. Questions?
The first one is, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about maybe the origins or the reasons for the income inequality or the wealth inequality that you showed early on.
Mhm.
It's like 10% of the wealthiest households make 10 times as much as the poorest households. I was wondering if you
The top 10% has an average daily income 10 times higher than the bottom 10%.
Okay.
That's our quantitative measure of how much inequality there is in the community.
So I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit more demographic or observational information about why that is. And then my second question was about, also related to income. I think in one of your slides you showed that wealthier households give more resources to poorer or wealthier households give more resources. So like, or there's a relation to wealth and giving to resources. I was wondering.
They also receive more too, though.
Mhm. I was wondering if you have made the analysis that adjusts the value of the resources that they give away to their to the household's wealth. So I guess I'm wondering what
They-
percentage or
yeah.
how's that ratio between the
The
things they're giving
wealthier
away?
households give away a lower percentage of their resources, but it's a higher total amount. And all the slides I showed here were in total amounts. So
Yeah.
it's probably not surprising, right? It's one of the things we did was interview the people in Linao and ask them, who do you think the biggest givers are in the community? And we asked for specific names of families, but we also asked for characteristics like, do you think that the people who live farther out in the ocean on the end houses give more than the ones who live closer to shore? That was just a nonsensical control. And they said, no, but the first thing they brought up was income. The Linao people believe that the biggest givers are also the highest income people, and they believe that the biggest receivers are the lowest per capita income families. And they're partially right about that, but what they don't realize is that, so they predicted correctly that the wealthier families give more, but they did not predict correctly that the wealthier families get more than anybody else.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what else. What I would say about income inequality is that we don't have a lot of really great measures, I think, in most traditional societies, and maybe there's a little bit of mythology about egalitarianism that is a little overblown. I don't know if I've ever seen it for the Hadza, but I recently did this for the Aceh, and the answer was that the top 10% of hunters were bringing in 7 times more meat per day than the bottom 10%. So that's not pure egalitarianism either. Probably there haven't been human societies where you have really, really flat. But on the other hand, if you were to run the Gini coefficient, it's way lower than most modern societies. and it's way lower than the Philippine National Society too. So they're more egalitarian than a lot of societies, but they're not totally egalitarian.
Thank you.
Another question? Yeah.
No, sorry, there were two choices, okay. I have a question, maybe sort of following up a little bit on the income space. You had mentioned that the families who leave and go perhaps seasonally, or maybe not seasonally, but randomly to Indonesia, or other communities actually receive less.
Yeah.
Is part of the motivation for leaving an economic one? Because
It's hard to know which way the causality
Yeah.
runs, right? All I can tell you is that my sense is that those families are slightly less integrated. They're not as socially integrated into the community because they leave a lot. And that's probably part of the reason why they're not getting as much stuff. But it may be reverse. It may be that people don't treat them very well, and so they feel more like they want to leave and go elsewhere. All I know is we've got some families that are really nomadic and are always, they don't go on really long trips, but they'll often leave for a week at a time and go to other places in their boats up and down the coast. And those families are giving less and receiving less of everything than the ones who live full year round in the community.
they go to other communities that's part of the larger network?
They go all the way to Indonesia and Malaysia on one side and to New Guinea on the other side. I did interviews where I asked, what was the farthest you've been this year in the last 365 days? And I had families that went all the way to Sabah in Borneo and all the way to New Guinea on the other side. So we're talking about thousands of miles of ocean travel.
And are they meeting with people they know, or they just?
They're always going to
Go see
always going to Sama communities, yeah. They don't, the Sama people in this region of the world are still really at the low end of the socio-economic totem pole, whatever. That term that I use, Bajau, they're widely known by that all through Southeast Asia, but it's a nasty word. It's a derogatory ethnic slur. And when you ask people in the Philippines, if you were to go to Manila and say, you know, what do you think of the Bajau? They would say, oh, they're disgusting beggars and blah, blah. So, yeah, they can't go, they can only go visit other Samal communities. They can't really go anywhere else. Brian.
I wanted to ask, I didn't see it on a graph, but it's a service, maybe even a good that's really fitness relevant, which is what people do when others are sick or injured. Do you see that kind of service or possible the provisioning of medicine? Is that all handled within?
The service was
community
called
or-
caretaking, and we did get, we got examples and we got minutes of that, but it was so overwhelmed by child caretaking and babysitting that it looked like a small fraction. But again, maybe measuring in minutes is not the right measure in terms of how much, what is the marginal impact on fitness? Taking care of somebody who's sick for maybe only a couple days maybe have a much bigger impact on fitness than babysitting their kids for months. And so we know it's happening, we recorded it. It's a small number of minutes, but it could be a really, really important piece of the game.
Do they do this internally, or are there healers they go to, or is there some outside?
No, they mainly were doing it internally. I messed with the system, so I can't tell you, because one of our agreements, everybody who's doing ethical fieldwork anthropology knows you have nice agreements with your study populations. One of my agreements right off the bat with the chief is that I would cover all medical expenses for the entire village during the whole period of study. So every time there was anything serious, I took them to a hospital and I paid the bills, all the medicine and all the doctor bills. So I messed with the system. I don't know what they would have done if I hadn't been there. Yeah.
I was curious, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your perspective on the history of the reciprocity debate, because I agree with you in your interpretation of the importance of reciprocity in human affairs, and the data that you have seem great. I also understand, the technical point that people have made about causation and correlation. But it also seems to me like, in science, we're kind of making inference to the best explanation usually, and the most plausible explanation given our data. And if you combine that with the fact that anthropologists have been saying for probably 100 years that like reciprocity between non-kin is,
Mhm.
I mean, it's one of the few things that you can almost say is a universal right in the ethnographic literature. This point's been made for a long time. Like, I guess I'm curious. I know you're sympathetic to this explanation, but why has there been so much resistance in the evolution community to this?
I
It
think,
seems like the best explanation.
I don't know about the resistance. What I know is that the really nitpicky scientists that have heard me talk about this have pointed out, here's an example. Suppose that we just had a social norm that we give more to tall people. If that was true, it would turn out that tall people, let's say tall people both give more and receive more, just in general. For some reason, tall people get more and you'd end up seeing a correlation between giving and receiving in general, and also between dyads. When you found two tall people in the dyads, it would look like they're giving more than everybody else to each other, and they're receiving more from everybody else to each other. So technically, you could say a correlation still doesn't convince me, but my personal, ethnographic insight is that this is reciprocity. I've heard them talk about it. We're going to go back and ask questions like, why did you give this to these why questions? Why is it that you're giving to this person and not that person? And then I think we're going to get really strong support for the idea that they're going to say, oh, I give to them because they give to me. So.
No, I mean, if I could just follow up for a second, I think that makes sense. I mean, the weird thing about when I hear examples like when you're giving, because you're right. I mean, and I've heard those kinds of things too. But kind of people will say something like, well, you give to tall people or popular people. I mean, there has to be a plausibility to that mechanism too, right? For it to be the more plausible explanation for the data than reciprocity. And
the really nitpicky people who've critiqued us on this have said, we're not going to buy the term reciprocity until you can show me through some kind of accidental intervention or experimental intervention that if you get one party to cut off their giving, that the other party then subsequently cuts off their giving as well. That's the evidence they want in order to conclude that it's reciprocity.
Yeah.
So we'll see what we can do about that.
Yeah.
There's a question from the audience. Oh, now several, okay.
Oh, those are mainly me just typing it for the Zoom audience. But there's one.
Oh, I see.
Joe Mann.
But there's one, is teaching of subsistence techniques or anything else a service that is given and received between households?
Yes. Yeah, that showed up in our list of some of the types of things. When people pay a cost in their time in order that a model pays a cost so that an observer or a recipient improves their subsistence technique, that would come under what we're looking for, and yes, we got reports of that. So we did get teaching. I suspect it's probably underreported because a lot of times they don't really, the way we're having to, we're translating from English into Visaya and then into Samal, and their understanding, a lot of times they might not think that teaching is really doing a big favor for somebody, and it might take place in the context that I'm teaching you how to fish, but while I'm actually fishing myself anyways, so I'm letting you watch me fish, I'm going to get fish from it anyways. Does that really count as a helping behavior? We've got some problems with some of our categories that some stuff didn't show up. I laughed at all the stuff about coalitional support. Our informants didn't consider that to be helping behavior, and so we can't compare that to monkeys, for example, because they said that whenever you do that, you're really doing it for your own gain anyways, and they didn't want to call that helping behavior. There's a lot of methodological problems. My big message here is, so I did one study, but I want to see 10 more people go out and do studies, and then I think we're going to start learning more about what is really going on in small-scale human societies. And we made a lot of mistakes. There are things we're changing. In this next field session, we're going to record things and ask questions differently and so on.
Thanks.
Question?
Yeah, thanks for an interesting talk. I guess I was really interested about your, the transfer of goods, especially how a lot of the services are given to the younger children. And so I know that I think you might have briefly mentioned and said it was maybe something having to do with cooperative breeding, but I guess I'm also wondering, like, could there be other, like, alternative explanations? Like, could these be, like, cultural norms that might be related to, like, reciprocity? Or do you have any insight in any of that?
We need to do a lot more work on how much of what we see is ultimately being driven by cultural norms, and what are the sanctions for people who break those norms, and how detectable are they, and so on. Now, somebody today, who was I talking to about an alternative hypothesis for why they're giving to children? Somebody that I met with this morning. I got confused because I had 4 meetings. Maybe it was Dan. Something that I observed in the Aceh that came back to haunt me a little bit is I watched adult men in particular doing stuff for young boys who were like 11, 12, 13 years old. And we see this in Lee now, that the guys will come back and see the 12-year-old boys and give them a fish or some money or help them do something, whatever. And I started thinking, because I worked with the Aceh for 47 years, so I've had a chance to see longitudinally what's the effect. I'm now starting to suspect that some of that is alliance building, that the older men realize that he may only be 12 years old now, but in 6 years from now he's going to be 18 and he's going to be a big strong guy, and I want him as my ally. So I'm going to cultivate him for the next 6 years and be really kind to him, because 10 years down the line we're both going to be alive and there's going to be a conflict and he's going to have my back. He's going to be on my side. So I now think that some of what's going on with children is cultivating alliances given the long human lifespan and the fact that they aren't going to be children for very long before they're now adults, and that's a whole different game.
Can I follow that up just a little bit?
Yeah.
Because when you say it came back to haunt you, I assume what you mean is that there are things going on 15 years ago that are bleeding into your observation period that you have no window into. So have you considered, for example, interviewing people to assess their connections to one another in an earlier time? Like, could you get inter-household
We haven't
ratings
tried
on-
that, but
Okay.
my example from the Aceh, you'll love this, is that way back in the 70s and 80s, one of the things that puzzled me a little bit about being in the forest on foraging trips is a lot of times at the end of the day, the hunters would come back and I would watch them play with the boys. So that they would hang out with 11, 12-year-old boys and play with them and tickle them and give them a little bit of extra honey and stuff. And when I remember seeing that in the 80s thinking, what the hell's going on here? Why are these 40-year-old men playing around with 8-year-old boys? But then because I stayed there for 40 years, the answer was that 10 years later, those boys were grown full adults and they were allies of the guys who had cultivated a relationship with them. And then I said, okay, now this makes sense. I didn't know what was going on, but those old men, they knew what they were doing. They knew that the boy's going to be grown up in a few years and they want him as an important ally. So yeah, that's what I meant by it came back to haunt me later. Took me 15 or 20 years to figure out what I think was probably going on.
So, sorry.
Oh no, there's just, Dan has his hand raised on Zoom.
Do you mind moving for a second, and so Dan can ask a question?
Okay, thanks. Sorry, been out there for a minute. Thanks, Ken, really interesting talk. Your response to Brian just now actually, I think, fits with something that I was going to suggest, which is given the high resolution of the data that you have in terms of the economic aspects, it seems like you should entertain the possibility that some of these exchanges have no economic importance at all, and instead, these are tokens, right? So, just the way that, for example, people say hello when they pass in the hall, right? There is no substantive value, it's the symbolic value that matters.
Yep.
Certainly when it comes to, giving pennies to children, if you're counting that in terms of household income, then the total effect on the household is probably trivial at any one exchange point, but the symbolic value is probably high.
Dan, you're stealing the words right out of my mouth. It's actually on my slide. When do I have to
Unmute, yeah.
on?
Sorry.
Am I unmuted? Let's see.
I think you're
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah, Dan, you're stealing the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say exactly that. I puzzled over and over about why people were day after day after day giving a nickel to the kids. And, my sense from asking a few questions is this is what happens. There's no economic significance of the nickel, but there's a very strong symbolic significance that the little kids run home and tell mommy and daddy, oh, Joe just gave me a nickel. And then tomorrow they do the same thing. After a week, the parents have a really positive attitude towards Joe, that Joe keeps giving my kids a little bit of money for candy every day. And yeah, it's not materially significant. It's a symbolic demonstration that you intend to be a cooperator and a collaborator with them, and people read it that way. If I give over and over again small trinkets to the children, their parents find out about it, and their parents start liking me. I think anybody can imagine this if you've ever lived in a human society. So when we saw thousands, literally thousands of cases of them giving less than 10 cents, I said, this is not about material help. This is about some kind of symbolic reaffirmation of an alliance, an affiliation. So that would be my guess too, yeah.
Thanks.
I think we have time for one or two more questions before the coffee, and then I hope people will join us for coffee and more questions afterwards.
I should have talked longer.
Yeah, right.